and enriches our competitors. And so we don't believe that that's a good solution. So we're all searching for ways to resolve this conflict right now. I know that the universities and labs are forming networks. They're sharing information better. They're finding ways to look for security breaches. They're sharing best practices. And that's certainly a way that we're trying to address the problem from within our own community. Another way that we're doing this is by talking more widely. The National Academy of Science convened a series of closed-door discussions to bring all the sides in this issue in the United States. That is, the security agencies, the university administrators, the funding agencies, to bring them all into the same room. And these are going to continue. And this is very important if we're going to find some solutions. In physics, which is only one part of science, but it's highly international, we have our own voice in this matter. And in our view, a healthy community is one, in the United States, is one where there's a partnership between scientists and the government. On the scientist side, we have to live up to the highest standards of scientific integrity. It's important for the conduct of science, and that includes transparency. It includes disclosure of conflicts of commitment. It includes reciprocity. So when we collaborate, it has to be a two-way street. And also the protection, this is very important, the protection of our research before it's published. That is, while we're doing the research and while we're coming up with the solutions to science problems, there has to be privacy of that research. The government on its side has to recommit to the policy that Brad just outlined, this NSDD 189 that goes back to the Reagan administration, although every few years it gets reaffirmed, and as recently as this last year, as we heard, that fundamental research has to remain open to the fullest extent possible, and that if it's necessary, the mechanism to protect national security is classification. So we started to engage also the Chinese physics community, our Chinese counterparts. We've had closed-door meetings between a few leading physicists convened by the American Physical Society and Chinese counterparts from the Chinese Academy of Sciences and other Chinese scholarly organizations. And what we find when we talk scientist to scientist without large amplified speakers, just between ourselves, we find that there's really no disagreement about the need for the elements of integrity that I just laid out. That is transparency, disclosure of conflicts, reciprocity, and the protection of research results prior to publication. We've also met with physics leaders from Europe and from Canada, South America, elsewhere in Asia. And we've learned that the rest of the world is actually fully informed about the decline in the US as a destination for the top graduate students, and they are eager to fill this gap. The UK has started a fast track system for STEM students seeking a visa. And there was just a report looking at some data from Canada, and it found that there was a surge in US resident non-citizens, that is, in people who reside in the US but are not US citizens, requesting residency in Canada. It's effectively doubled in the last couple of years. And we've also been working with Congress. We all know that most students are not spies, and a good way to limit the influence of the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese military would be by offering US citizenship to promising scientists who would like to stay. And so there's a Keep STEM Talent Act introduced by Senator Durbin that provides a path to a green card and citizenship for international students that is currently in the Judiciary Committee in the Senate in this session. Of course, Congress listens to people like us to formulate those policies, but they also listen to the security establishment. And Senator Portman's committee, which is the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, released a report last year that basically tried to bring together all of these security problems and their implications. And although they do mention the important contributions that international students make to our science community, the main message was that Chinese exchange programs, such as the talent program, are designed to harm the US. That's the main message from that. That's turned into legislation now, which is called the Safeguarding American Security Act. And that bill would create a very strong oversight, Federal Research Security Council in the White House to coordinate security oversight over grants in all the funding agencies. This is done for greater security. The difficulty, of course, is that we have to be very vocal about commenting on how that kind of thing is carried out, because it could be subject to great overreach. And we've seen some examples of the tendency for overreach in executive orders coming out of the White House just this past year. Other groups, of course, are also weighing in on this. The Hoover Institute last week released its own report, and it analyzes the depth of the collaborations between U.S. researchers and scientists, particularly from some of these specific Chinese universities that are named as having ties to the military. And they point out that these are not themselves evidence of security breaches, but they certainly do leave the reader feeling that the Chinese scientists are now all around us, firmly connected to universities all around the country. And then they go on in that Hoover Institute report to recommend how universities can build a more secure research environment. Very much along the lines of some of the things that we've already been talking about. Transparency, disclosure of conflicts of commitment, but done in a very systematic way that could potentially help us at least feel that we're achieving more control over our security. Now, the White House has been weighing in on this. They, together with the Department of Homeland Security, they've been issuing a series of executive orders and rulings related to excluding various classes of STEM workers. Brad talked about this. Often these include students, and often these executive orders have a connection to the COVID crisis, but the university community is certainly increasingly anxious about this. Just to give a flavor for these, the first one on May 29th suspended entry to the US for Chinese students that implement or support this military civil fusion strategy. And as Brad mentioned, that we don't know how that's being implemented yet. In fact, we don't even know what list the government tends to use for institutions that are aligned with the military. The Hoover report, by the way, listed 7. The Australian report, Brad also mentioned, listed 56. And these are among some of the main universities that our graduate students come from, and that also have administrators who were trained in our universities, working now as high-level administrators in the universities in China. There have been other executive orders. Some of them we've really successfully pushed back on. There was a warning that one would eliminate a visa program called OPT that a lot of our students use after they get a degree and before they go on with their career. And that was blocked, I think, because of a lot of community action that informed their members of Congress and got a letter from a lot of Republican congressmen written to the White House to help turn that off. But there have been other proclamations. There was a proclamation that restricted new H-1B visas, and there was an order from ICE that would cancel the F-1 visas for any international student who couldn't take an in-person class in the U.S., even in the midst of this crisis. That one was dropped. Harvard and MIT sued, and so much community support supported their lawsuit for an injunction that the government just dropped it. But these things are, of course, continuing, and so the the next step from our point of view is continue to talk, shine a light on these problems, and make our case, as Brad has pointed out, that there really is no choice to not engage internationally. And China is a big place. It's a wealthy place. It's a technologically advanced place. It has great scientists. We know that. And we have to engage with them. And we simply have to find a way to do that that doesn't jeopardize our security.
Thanks, Phil. So one thing I want to ask both of you about is the way that we as people in higher ed should parse the issues and address the issues with, perhaps, as I think you're both recommending, new practices, new behaviors within universities as a way to address the concerns that are coming from the federal government, particularly the intelligence agencies. So there is the first is research integrity, which is related to conflict of interest and conflict of commitment. Um, as the Hoover Institution report talks about, their model is a much more proactive model of behavioral change, against what they, I think, call a compliance-driven model. And certainly, as a professor, I'm well aware of the requirements once a year, usually, to fill out the forms, to take some video training, to reduce the possibility that there'll be some sort of violation of research and integrity. And so, my impression is those things have already been strengthened in the sense that they seem more important to the way in which universities are going about having faculty be aware of those concerns. So research integrity is one. The second is intellectual property, including, as Phil pointed out, the ability to keep your research your own until it's published. And then also relatedly is technology transfer. When you do have, I'm a political scientist, so I don't think we ever actually create things that people would pay for. But we, in the STEM fields, this is a really important, as well as medical, right, for technology transfer. And then finally, national security. And national security is this issue of allowing research to be done in such a way, in collaboration with Chinese scientists or Chinese institutions, that hurts our national security. So these are, to me, very separate but related issues, and I wanted to ask you to talk about some ways in which we can parse these out to make them distinct in how we address them. Related to that, and to the national security issue, is a kind of extended question, which is, my reading of the Hoover Institution report and the way that the analysis was done is that it showed 254 peer-reviewed articles that were published in either English or Chinese that included authors who, in some cases, were from American institutions, and then from institutions in China that are affiliated directly with the military, the so-called Seven Sons. Those 254 articles were published, and they because they are co-authored, they appear to demonstrate collaboration between American academics and academics in China affiliated with the military. As you say, Phil, there's no claim in the article or evidence of clear breach of national security. But what it seems to say in the report is that any aiding and abetting of the Chinese military, any strengthening of the Chinese military, is by default a harm to US national security. If that's my reading of the report, and if that's what the report and many other ways in which it's been spoken about at the federal level, that to me then says that foundational research or fundamental research when it's done in collaboration with Chinese scientists, especially at these universities, but I think probably broader than that, um, risk U.S. national security. So if that's if that's the kind of claim, and if that is how it's defined by the federal government, how can universities respond? And what would be the costs of that to our own research superiority?
Well, let's talk about the cost first, um, because right now, fundamental research done at the university level is in the STEM fields is largely carried out by graduate students and postdocs. The number of those that are international is about half. The number of that half who are Chinese is about, well, in physics, I guess I'm only speaking off the top of my head. So the numbers I keep in my head are physics. So is about a third of that half. That's a lot of talented students. So, and I think this goes to the crux of what harm does it do to us to isolate ourselves from China. The first harm that it does to us, in my view, and I think the view of a lot of the science community, is it cuts us off from some of the best, most talented people. And the proof that these are among the best and most talented people is all around us. Every major university has world-class faculty, many of whom are Chinese and originally came to this country as students. And many of, and it's not just that, look at our national labs. Many of our research laboratories are also headed by people who came here as foreign graduate students from China. So we're cutting ourselves out from that talent. Now, the sort of underlying response to the other side of that argument, which would be, yeah, but we have to cut ourselves off from them because otherwise that we're simply feeding their military all of our best ideas, is that twofold. First, by the same token, we don't want to feed the Chinese military the best people, do we? And this is one of the things that would automatically happen with that cutoff. There's not even any dispute that would happen. Yes, it would. But the other point has to do with the way to effect an ethical scientific enterprise, which is through these mechanisms that are actually also discussed in the other chapter of the Hoover report about enforcing disclosure, enforcing transparency, making sure that contracts are not just a contract between a US professor or a scientist and a university in China. That's not a very even deal, is it? But rather the contract would be, if a collaboration is going to exist, has to be at a parallel level. Just those kinds of things. Full understanding of who you're dealing with. Of course, in science, transparency is never a bad thing. The business about theft of fundamental research occurs at the not yet published level, at the unpublished level, and it is a real problem, and it is not simply a problem with China. It's a problem between research groups, U.S. to U.S. even. I mean, it's a very important issue that scientists should have the right and on the other side also the obligation to not share the results until they're ready to be shared. And of course, then once they're ready to be shared, as you point out, agencies mandate that they be shared in a way that's very public for fundamental research. And I think that's the way to answer that kind of a charge that we need to stop doing research with our Chinese collaborators.
Brad, do you want to add anything?
You're muted, Brad.
That's a great answer. I just want to add a couple of things, and that is, I think that when the intelligence community uses the term intellectual property, it's using it in an expansive way. So as Phil said, what we're really talking about is ideas and data at the pre-publication level. So this is not copyrighted material. This is not patented material. This does not fit the conventional definition of intellectual property. What it does is, I think, really raise the stakes politically, because it conflates it with a very serious problem that the business community in China has experienced with intellectual property theft, and with the theft of intellectual property in the private sector in the United States, which is a problem as well. So it's a way of escalating the rhetoric by calling this intellectual property. But I would agree with Phil here. It really falls under that umbrella of research integrity. This is something that institutions know how to deal with. They are struggling with it, but every major research university I know is taking this seriously and is developing a plan of action. I'll just say one thing about that Hoover report, and I do think everyone should take a look at that. What they're saying in that was, my understanding was they were not arguing that the problem is limited to those 7 universities. They were saying this is just the start. This was the easy pickings. This is what was publicly available. We could do Google searches, and we could do searches in the local library and come up with a fairly comprehensive look at how those 7 universities are engaged with the rest of the world. But that really was saying, they were arguing that that's just the starting point. So we got you started, but we expect all of you listening to really take this to the next level. And that's where I think our work really has to be, is sort of deciding what, as a community, we're going to define as inappropriate partners in China. Mary, I think you're right. I think that that attempt to sort of create that third category of research, what NSF calls intermediate between fundamental and national security, that's you're exactly hitting it on the head. Fundamental research that could eventually turn into something with applications that would make China more economically competitive or more militarily strong. That's a conversation we've never had in the research community here. So I think it is very troubling.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead, Phil.
Just a brief follow-up on that. On that last point, again, when they're talking about this sort of sensitive but unclassified research, of course, it's also unpublished. So all of this comes under the category of unpublished, because once published, what's sensitive? Anybody can pick up the journal anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. And particularly with open access coming, which is, of course, a completely different conversation, it'll be even easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. That's a great point too. I also just have to say, as a social scientist who works on China, one of the impacts, I think, or kind of a side effect of what will be happening, or what is already happening, is there will also be retaliation, and there will be impacts on our own access to the field, which is really already happening in China, as the Chinese, the government and the Communist Party in China have become much more closed to foreign researchers. And I feel many Chinese researchers also feel like it's much more difficult now in China to do research, particularly on the political system. But the US government, with its own new initiatives to restrict Fulbrights, to canceling the Fulbrights to China and Hong Kong, will have a huge impact on our access to what we know about China, which again is actually, I think, very important to the national security and to the intelligence communities. And it's a real counterproductive move on the part of the US government to restrict our own access to research in China. We have a hard enough time with the Chinese government. We don't need our own government further restricting us. I just have one last question for Brad very quickly before I open up to some questions that we have about the recommendation to work directly university to university. So we know that Chinese universities not only are they all public in the same way that, say, the University of Michigan is public as a state level university, Chinese universities have affiliations either to the ministry or to some municipal level bureau. But the control of Chinese universities by the party, by the organization department, by the Chinese Communist Party is much stricter and is restricting academic freedom in China for sure. But wouldn't it also be a barrier to the kind of university to university level negotiations and drawing up of, say, norms and rules? What isn't there a barrier to that plan?
I think it's a great, first of all, it's a great question. I think that if we were talking about the certain areas in the social sciences where you're very active, yeah, there would be limitations. What I argue in my paper is this is a community, and I would include the government in this, that is benefited enormously from global engagement. If you look at all the disciplines in China that have risen the most rapidly, it's been through international collaboration. And so I think there is a deep understanding of the benefits of staying engaged. And Phil mentioned that at least in the physics community and talking to other university leaders in China, I've come to the same conclusion. There is actually broad consensus on what research integrity is and what the norms should be. So there's frustration within China at the extent to which these norms are not followed. The other thing I did with Mary's graduate student, Chad Westra, is really look at all the letters that I could find, all the appointment letters under the 1,000 Talents plan. And I may be the only person who actually read every one that's publicly available. But it's fascinating in the sense that each institution clearly is left to define the terms of engagement with each individual scholar. So if we were seeing this sort of monolithic top-down national strategy to use the terms of the FBI to extract intellectual property by any means necessary, I think that's the exact terminology they use, I think you'd see a much more coordinated, standardized approach. And in fact, these letters are all over the place. And that's how you end up with someone making $50,000 a month US for a part-time position in China. So it's I think a decentralized problem. Now, could the Chinese government change their mind tomorrow and say, now we're making this something that we're going to address at the national level? Absolutely. And there's certainly, if you look at things like the appointment of senior leadership, the content of the required curriculum at the undergraduate level. I mean, it's completely different from the United States. So I don't want to suggest that we're looking at a mirror image of what we have in the U.S. But I do think there's solid ground for collaboration on this.
Thanks, Brad. Okay, so let me go to some of the questions. We have quite a few already. So I'm just going to read the questions, and I don't have time to sort of parse them out. But this question comes from Mark Elliott. I like the idea of a higher education summit. Cynics might point to the Hefei statement of 2013, which emerged out of a similar kind of meeting of minds in international higher ed, and which seems to have had no effect in halting the narrowing of academic freedoms at Chinese universities. How would a future meeting and any resulting agreement need to be structured in order to provide the kind of reassurances of transparency and academic collaboration and exchange that would be required for a successful reset? So either Phil or Brad, I know Phil has also been involved through the American Physical Society in not necessarily university to university, but associations working on similar initiatives.
It was one point that comes to mind with that idea of a summit is that it's really important to keep in mind that not only the heterogeneity that Brad spoke about of Chinese universities, but the competitiveness. This is something that we heard from our Chinese counterparts with respect to the 1,000 Talents program. That one of the they get into bidding wars, for example. And some of the things that have been put forward as just, egregious efforts to bribe. Well, of course, they do appear on the face of it to be efforts to bribe, but the motivation may not merely be to help the greater China, but to help that university in its rivalry with other universities. And there's a hierarchy, and so I assume that any kind of engagement that would be a meeting of all of the universities would come into that that problem. And the other one point I wanted to make, which is a point that you also touched on, is that there isn't really parallelism between the units, the institutional units in the two countries. Not that much. The Chinese Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences are quite different in their structure and in their influence and in their power. And so you have to be a little you have to be very, very understanding of that in setting up these kinds of engagements.
Great.
Just
Go ahead, Brett.
One point, and I know we got lots of questions, but one thing I didn't really touch on because I was conscious of time was that what we'd be talking about something very concrete, which would be recommended language for university agreements. And so this would be language that you would insert into any collaborative agreement between a US and a Chinese institution. And those standards would cover any individual research collaboration between those two institutions. And at the same time, you really, I think another recommendation has to be that an individual scholar cannot engage on their own. They have to do it under the umbrella of an institutional agreement. So if somebody comes and wants you to sign an agreement to become a participant in the 1,000 Talents program, you would not be able to do that unless your institution and the host Chinese institution had a pre-existing agreement.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, so let me go back to the Q&A. So this is from Paul Joy. Yesterday, Senator Marsha Blackburn, Republican from Tennessee, advocated for increased R&D to colleges and universities as a way to better compete with China at an event with the Hoover Institution. Is there bipartisan support for this position on Capitol Hill and beyond to individual institutions and systems?
There is, of course. There's always bipartisan support for raising research funding. In fact, as you well know, as possibly everybody on this call knows as well, that strong support in Congress is one of the things that's been keeping the research enterprise alive over the last 4 years, because it is not shared by the Office of Management and Budget and the White House in this administration. Mm-hmm. But the devil, of course, is in the details, and there already is other legislation that is going to greatly expand research funding. The Hoover report also pointed to increased research funding as one of the key elements of helping us compete better against possible security threats from China. So, doesn't mean in the era of deficits and deficit hawks that this would actually happen, but I think everyone understands that that's an important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, that's perfect. I don't have much to add. I'll just say that let me just tell a little bit about a focus group that we did. So I said we're doing this project on the career pathways for international students. And as part of that, we convened several focus groups in Middle America, working class Americans, and asked them what they thought about international students. So two interesting things. One is they totally get our dependency in key fields like physics. So they understand the need to recruit globally to get the best talent. And so it took very little persuasion or explanation. Yes, that's what will make our economy grow and contribute to competitiveness. But everybody said that the real problem was not enough Americans were going into STEM fields. That this was a temporary stopgap solution. The real solution is to get more Americans studying science, technology, engineering, and math. And so, yes, I think there's a lot of political support for R&D, but I think one of the key things here is to make sure that however you do it, it really does it it really executed in a way that attracts more Americans into these fields. And I feel we've been worrying about this for decades. I mean, we know that not enough Americans go into STEM fields. So I don't have the answer here, but I am telling you that this is potentially a political obstacle.
I just have to add, as director of the International Institute and former director of the China Center at Michigan, that in addition to funding for STEM, it's absolutely critical that the federal governments fund area studies and foreign language training, because actually the Hoover Institution report, or the report written in Australia, could not have been written unless the people had training in Chinese language. And most of the reports that are being done on this issue are being done by people who are probably funded by Title VI or a FLAS award. And those awards, I have to say, the support from them from the federal government has fallen pretty dramatically in the last 2 decades. So if anyone is listening out there on the webinar, please support foreign language education at the federal government level. I have another question. It's likely that sitting in a U.S. university today is a future leader of China. These person-to-person relationships are a foundation of, and this is an anonymous question, on which healthy lifetime bilateral interactions are built. Would this fracture be different under a Biden administration? And what efforts should be made to develop academic farm system by pushing more academic exchanges into K-12 education? And if so, how? And it is not anonymous. He put his name. It's Tom Watkins, who's the former Michigan State Superintendent.
Great. I'll start. I think that exchanges are something where, again, I think we can do a lot more to demonstrate the value. And so when I was a Title VI director for over 20 years, and this was what I think one of our great failings was, not coming up with better stories and messaging for the general public about the value of international expertise, and particularly with key places like China. The irony here is that the Chinese government has quite a bit of money for this, and if we wanted to get Americans to China, the Chinese would pay for a lot of it. And so China, this is one of the reasons we're talking today. China is becoming a wealthy country, and they can put money into higher education, and they can put money into exchanges at a scale that we may not be able to in the United States. So what we have seen, though, is a deterioration to the point where Americans may not even want to spend time in China. That's very concerning to me. And as far as the development of leaders in the other direction, I think, first of all, I would not assume that every Chinese experience in this country is positive. Just because they've done, Mary knows, I had lots of MBA students. A lot of them came away with a really enlightened view of the United States, but a lot of them really didn't learn very much about American culture. And they went back to their countries with a lot of technical expertise, but did not really see any really reshaping of their attitudes. We do tend to treat international students as commodities. We've got all the numbers, $42 billion in revenue that we get from international students every year at our institutions. And it's a very dangerous game to play. We should be paying a lot more attention to the entire experience of international students. How many of them make friends with Americans? How many of them get off campus and engage in extracurricular activities? One of the very most important activities is something Phil alluded to, the OPT, or the optional practical training. This is an opportunity with an F visa to get off campus, to work for an American company, to improve your English, and to actually polish your resume. It's a huge draw. And every time this administration threatens to cancel it, and I think for now it's okay. I think we may have sacrificed H-1B in order to save OPT, but that's just my opinion. But I think it's okay for now. But even hinting that might be canceled is a real deterrent for people to come to this country.
Thanks, Brad. Phil, do you want to add anything?
Just one thing, sort of at the level of visitors, rather than people who are coming here to get a degree, visiting scientists. One of the things that China is going to have in the future that they have not had in the past is their own international user facilities. That is, leadership class science instruments that only exist one place in the world, and that place happens to be China. And I think that that's going to be part of the leveling landscape that makes China an important destination. And I certainly hope we can continue on that path. And this is a path that is kind of necessitated by world economics in a way. But the effect on the science community could be huge.
Thank you. We have a lot of great questions. I'm not going to get through all of them in the next few minutes, but let me get to one that I think is important because we talked a bit about it already. This is from Minya at Boston University. How well do American scientists and the government know Chinese universities with historical ties to the military and have projects with the PLA does not mean close ties to the PLA operations today. Student scholars from such universities are quite from the military operation in general. So this is getting to this interpretation of, and I think this is a broader issue actually, because the executive order that will allow the State Department to deny visas to students who take part in universities that are involved in military civil fusion strategy, that could be a very, very broad class of universities, because most universities in China that have STEM are going to have probably some connection to the Chinese government and perhaps also the military. At the same time, it could be a super narrow definition of like the seven sons, but the seven sons may not be accurate anymore, because as Minya is pointing out, many of these universities have historical ties to the PLA, but they may not actually right now have any strong ties to the PLA. So either one, if you have any, not just to the question, but to this broader issue of classification of universities.
I don't know. I'd like to just start by pointing out that I don't think it's fair to be painting all of the students that come from a university as one way or the other based on the name of the university. These universities they can be big. Of course, there may be some that are super selective for spies, but generally what we're talking about when we're admitting students to graduate school are students that come from some of the large multi-program universities, and they should be, and also postdocs and junior scientists, they should be evaluated on the basis of these individual qualities of ethics that we talked about.
Thanks, Phil. Brad?
Yeah, I think that that's exactly right, what Phil said. But I just want to emphasize something I said really quickly earlier, which is we're now seeing multiple definitions of what risk is. And so you've got the Australian report, you've got the Hoover report, you've got a secret set of rules, and my own opinion is it will remain secret for a very long time, that is going to be screening visa applicants to come to this country. And all along, any visa officer interviewing a Chinese student who wants to come to the US can ask a question about their ties to the military. That's always been fair game. And one of the points we made about the Portman bill is that they're really just reiterating in that language what a visa officer already has the authority to do. So what that does is create a lot of confusion in China, and that means another deterrent for coming to the United States. When I gave my recommendations, I just want to hit on that again. I think this is where our community, the Chinese studies community, can really make a contribution, because we know China, we understand the connections between the Chinese military and higher education in ways that many people in the current administration don't. I think there's a way we can do this in a balanced way. So it's not just opposing what has already come out, but is really coming up with a much more thoughtful and nuanced response. If we don't do that, the criteria will be set for us.
Thanks. This is a question from Helena Kalenda from the Luce Foundation. Do current technologies make this issue harder because many more in the past have potential dual use applications?
Wow.
Bill, you
Just
Yeah, well, look, technology gets more and more sophisticated. There's no question about it. But it's often thought incorrectly that we do a lot of protection of our national security by banning exchange of information about technology that's actually already freely available. And that's it's important to keep in mind. I mean, there are always things that are cutting edge. There are always things that are pre-publication, and it's very important to protect those. As for the rest, it may be that there's a manufacturing capability that's kept secret by a manufacturer, and you want to protect that. But by and large, that is not the case, and so this is. A two-edged sword does have two edges on it. Put it that way. These should be thought of as not cure-alls, but just some of the things you can do.
And I think that the answer to Helena's question really depends on the discipline. And as I think APS has really been a model for how to engage these issues, and I think we're going to see more disciplinary groups grapple with these issues. I will say, I just talked to somebody, actually a Michigan professor in artificial intelligence the other day, who said, my field is totally global. I mean, I simply cannot do what I do without international connections. My students come from all over the world. My collaborators come from all over the world. I have no idea where to set the bar. Yes, artificial intelligence is having and will have military applications. We don't know what direction it's going in. But as you get closer to the experts, it becomes much more difficult to define.
Thanks, Brad. So we have about a minute left. I did just want to mention to people, in case they're wondering, we did actually bracket the conversation to talk very specifically about research collaboration in particular, and sort of bracketed the issues of influence that Brad mentioned, things like and restrictions on academic freedom of Chinese students, perhaps from pressure from their own government. Those are other really important issues, and we just didn't have the time to discuss them today. In addition to that, we didn't really discuss in great detail, again, because of time, the limits that are occurring in China now related to academic freedom, and also the growing concern about, Brad mentioned it, the use of technologies to restrict the freedoms of people in China, including in Xinjiang and also in Hong Kong. So those are other issues that, of course, are important, but we just didn't have time to discuss them. So we are officially out of time right now. There are other questions, so hopefully we'll take a picture of the chat and relay them to Phil and Brad. A lot of great questions about Chinese students and how to better integrate them into American campuses. I want to thank our other panelists today, and also to thank the National Committee and the Michigan China Innovation Center for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.